We began not only one mimer, but actually two different essays in this Sefer Lahachios Am Rav, from a Rav of a community in Thames River in New Jersey. And I'd like to focus in on these two Mamorim, copies of which you have. And they are Mamorim Dalid and Zayin. Now, in Maimer Dalid, he has a question that was asked of him: why are we so quick to close the shuls and to terminate Tefillah B'Tzibur, to close the yeshivas and bring an end to Talmud Torah in the yeshivas? Is the situation so drastic and so radical that we have to take those measures? And we know how important it is to have the shuls open, how important it is to have the yeshivas going full swing. Why are we going to such extremes? And the one who asked the question added that we believe that every human being is written down up in Shamayim for what we call a Zman Katsu, Kuf Tzadi Vav Beis, which means a set amount of time. And it's all in the hands of the Ribono Shel Olam. So Mimanav Shach. If it's already in the cards, so to speak, and there was a gzera that a person's going to die, then he's going to die with or without these extreme measures of protection. And if, on the other hand, the gzera is that he'll live, and we know that the Gemara tells us on every Rosh Hashanah we are inscribed in the Sifrei Chaim, or perhaps in the opposite. So then, why are we taking these extreme measures? If we're meant to live, we will live, and that's part of the divine plan. If not, then there's nothing we can do to change that destiny that's already been engraved in stone up in the Sifrei Achayim, or the opposite. So this is the presentation of the Shoel, and what we want to study today in terms of this Maimer, and then we want to go on to Maimer Zayin. This is Maimer Dalid, is the response to this person. Now, what surprises us, in a sense, is that nothing is black and white. Back in the year Tuf Kuf Tzadi Aleph, which is approximately 150 years ago, there was a cholera epidemic in Hungary. It affected other countries as well. And the government wanted to close all synagogues and all public areas like schools and so forth because people were carrying germs. And the Chassam Sofer was opposed. We cannot close the shuls. We cannot close the schools. And his psak was that despite the shiltonot, nevertheless, he says that the Gemara tells us in Masechta Brachos that when there was a gzera of the Malchus or Shah, the Romans, against the study of Torah publicly, a fellow by the name of Pafus ben Yehuda found Rabbi Akiva teaching publicly, gathering together masses of Jewish people to teach the Torah. And he turns to Rabbi Akiva and he says, "Aren't you afraid of the kingship?" And he gives him the famous mashal of the fox who tells the fish to go out of the water. And why are you running away from me in the water? Come out and let's meet on dry land. And of course, the fish says, "You're the fox. You're supposed to be the wise fox. Don't you realize that if we leave the water, we're going to perish?" And Rabbi Akiva uses this as a mashal, the nimshal of which is that if we don't continue learning Torah, we need it. It's our water. It's the Ein Mayim El Torah. It's Kihem Chayenu B'Yorch Yameinu. Then certainly we'll perish. And therefore, the Chassam Sofer concluded, based on Kihem Chayenu B'Yorch Yameinu, that we cannot be poresh from Torah. And Dafka, he says, B'shas HaSakana, because of the nature of this danger, Ein L'Rapos Yodenu El L'Hachzik Bo. We should be even more dedicated to the study of Torah. It's Chayim L'Machzikim Bo. It's like the muscle of someone who's going down the stream and he's grabbing onto a branch of a tree that was washed away into the river, and that branch could save his life. And therefore, the Chassam Sofer derives the conclusion that even though it was a Shas Sakana, and Dafka perhaps because of the Sakana, the Talmidim should stay in the Makom Chiyus, in a place where they can continue living. We cannot close the yeshiva. They should continue Shkida al Dalsels, Beis HaMedrash, and then Hashem will protect us and have compassion on us. And a year later, the Chassam Sofer delivered a drasha in Tov Kuf Tzadi Beis, in which he says that the reason why the Jews were saved from this cholera epidemic is because we kept the yeshivas open and the Bachura yeshiva didn't die. Not one in our yeshiva perished. So we have now a complex situation, because on the one hand, we have a tshuva that's Chassam Sofer based on this Gemara in Masechta Brachos, the story of Rabbi Akiva, that we have to keep the yeshivas going. And that's critical and even more important during a time of danger. And now we start a new paragraph, which is called Mi'idach Gisa, on the other hand. And we're looking at the other end of the equation. And here we have a Gemara in Bava Kama Daf Samach. Dever Ba'ir, if there is some sort of a plague in the city, Kanes Raglacha, take your feet and bring them indoors. Lock yourself up. Quarantine yourself. Shedemar, and the pasuk says, "V'atem lo teitzu ish mi Pesach beiso ad boker." Moshe Rabbeinu instructs the Jewish people not to go out of the front doors on that night when the Mashnis was endangering the lives during Makas Bechoros, but even endangering the lives of the Jewish people. And the Gemara then quotes the pasuk, "Lech ami bo b'chadarecha sgard al sosecha badecha." Go, my people, into your rooms and lock the doors behind you. We see clearly that b'shas dever, during a magefa, kanes raglacha, liskar dalsos badecha. And therefore, we are in a quandary here, because we don't know how to explain the tshuva of the Chassam Sofer in the light of the principle clearly formulated by the Gemara Bava Kama. I'm fascinated by this. I don't know if you gentlemen are excited about this. Again, I'm not, Corona is not meant to excite us, but Torah does excite us. And this, to me, is a fascinating issue, because how do we justify a tshuva of the Chassam Sofer, which is based on an Agadita, a story about Rabbi Akiva, and that tshuva of the Chassam Sofer, which he implemented and ruled halacha l'maisa, and not only that, he waved his banner of success, proving that he was right. How do you reconcile this with the Gemara's clear formulation? The ruling is kanes raglacha, stay at home, be quarantined. It's dangerous out there. There's dever ba'ir. And all this is so relevant to our situation today. We now have the study of a tshuva of the Rashbash, which is quoted by Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and he writes, and this tshuva might possibly be the source and the basis for the Chassam Sofer, opening up with the words Ever Ba'ir, quoting the Gemara in Bava Kama that we mentioned earlier. He says it means that the Malach HaMaves is out there lurking with his kalim. He's got his, his sword in hand. But he says the following. When it says, don't go out, where are you going? If you're going to a place where there are Malande Dardiki, where there are people who are teaching children Torah, You're going out to daven b'tzibur, says the Rashbash. And if Hashem finds a Beis HaKnesses without Malamdei Tinokos, or without a minion, then we are roy la'onesh. We are deserving of punishment. And he quotes two sources for this. First, the Gemara in the second parak of Shabbos, the Avon Bittul Torah. I don't even want to read the next two words, but in Mason. And the Gemara proves some psukim that if we discontinue the study of Torah, that's very dangerous. Then he quotes a Gemara at the end of Masechet Shabbos, Beis Knesset she'ein mispalin bo asara. And the Gemara says in Masechet Shabbos that Beis Knesset, if there aren't 10 people, Hashem gets angry. Where are the 10 people to form the minyan? And therefore he says, you know, when the Malach HaMavis is out there with his Kalim, that's when we have Yechidim. They're individuals who are so vulnerable to the Malach HaMavis. However, B'tzibur, Lispalel, Tfilas Tzibur, V'tfilas Tzibur Nishmas, it will be heard on high. V'chozru B'tshuva. He says in that case, certainly Hashem Yisbarach Yimchol Aleinu V'al Kol Amo Yisrael Baracham. That's what he writes. And to summarize this, the Rashbash takes what we thought was the most explicit source in Chazal, the Gemara Bava Kama, Kanes Raglacha, that addresses our very situation as if it was written today. And we thought, what are we going to do with the Chassam Sofer? Now we're going back to the period of the Rishonim. And he writes that this applies, Kanes Raglacha, when you're a Yechidi, when you're doing this on your own. And if we go to the shuls, and there's no one there, there's no tzibur, and there's no one teaching Torah, then we're exposed to the Malach HaMavis and all his tricks. And the author of this sefer writes, "V'nireh, it appears to me that Zeu Yisod Divrei Apsak Shel Chassam Sofer." He is absolutely convinced that the Chassam Sofer was basing himself on this tshuva of the Rashba. And now we go to a sort of middle of the road, or shall I say, I'm afraid to use this word because it sounds pejorative, but a tshuva that presents the opinion of the Stei Chemed, quoting an earlier tshuva, the Yishrei Lev, of confusion. We're in the year Taf Reish Chav Vav now. We're fast forwarding a little bit to 1866. And there's a breakout of a cholera epidemic in Yerushalayim Yer HaKodesh. And the Stei Chemed, who was the final word for the Yishuv in Yerushalayim at that time, at the end of the 1800s, was asked, what should we do on Yom Kippur? There's a cholera epidemic. Ma lasos hidasu kidin b'tzom hakadosh ki arofim tzivu bekruchya kekruchya shem yisanu yesh sakana afiu libriim. The Rofim have determined that even healthy people will be vulnerable to cholera if they don't eat, if they fast. And he writes, Umahases lahoros heter biyom hakodesh hazeh. He is inhibited, he is devastated to issue a psak on the Yom Kadosh that we can eat on Yom Kippur. Ki bitchonenu belokim yisbarach shmo shomer Yisrael. If we fast on Yom Kippur, we will be protected by the protector of Israel. And he goes on and he says that he knows that in other cities in the Ashkenazic world, far from Yerushalayim, they were Moreh Heter, and they paskin to eat on Yom Kippur. And I suspect he has in mind Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. We'll get back to that in just a minute. But nevertheless, I cannot go down that path. And he says, just cut down the services on Yom Kippur, leave out some of the Nigunim. And he goes ahead and says, V'lo meis afilu echad bi'oso hayom. The Yezel Nes. Nes means a flag, a banner of victory. Li'enei ha'amim v'hasarim. Very reminiscent of the Chassam Sofer. In a certain sense, the Chassam Sofer is even more far-reaching than the Stei Chemed. The Stei Chemed doesn't want to allow us to eat on Yom Kippur, even though the Rofim say we have to eat on Yom Kippur. The Chassam Sofer is talking about opening up shuls, having public minyanim, keeping the yeshivas going. That, in my opinion, is much more far-reaching than allowing fasting on one day out of the year. But as I said before, the picture here becomes very confusing. There doesn't seem to be any clear psak.
So I'm sorry. The Stei Chemed said not to fast or to fast.
He said he couldn't get himself to paskin like they did in other countries in Europe that we should eat on Yom Kippur. He just couldn't say it. He couldn't get it out of his mouth. This is the Yom Kadosh, he calls it. And therefore, I cannot go that far. He would not allow himself to rule that we should eat on Yom Kippur. All he could get himself to do was to cut down, abridge the services, cut out some of the singing. I don't know in your shuls if they sing Hineni, what's it called? Not Hineni. Hineni ha'ani mimas. You remember that? So again, if anyone knows my shul in Flatbush in Brooklyn where I was raised, there was Chazan Chatzkel Arida, Hineni ha'ani mimas. Took him about a half hour to sing it. Let's do away with it, says the Stei Chemed. We got to get home and take it easy. On Yom Kippur, there's a cholera epidemic out there. But he didn't have the gumption, if you could call it that, to go one step further and rule that the Jews should eat on Yom Kippur, even though he quotes the Ashkenazim who did so, and we'll get back to that in Mirz Hashem in a few minutes. But what fascinates me is that the Machaber here, the author of this Sefer, tries to, I don't know, he doesn't say it explicitly, but I get the feeling from the flow of it that he's trying to juggle and somehow to reconcile these various positions. And he says that on the one hand, ain't somchen ala nes. For sure, the Gemara says that, and we're going to get back to this point over and over again, kanes raglacha, because of the dever. And for sure, we have to listen to the atzas harofim. But he says, perhaps it depends on achuzei hasikun. Ukfar kasavti li'el le'inyan achuzei hasikun. Now, let me try to explain what this means, because I think there's a lot here in that one sentence. We are now studying the fourth Maimar, fourth essay in this Sefer. Here, he refers back, I think, he doesn't tell you, unfortunately, exactly where, but it seems to me that he is referring back to the second Maimar, which in the Sefer appears on page Chafhet. That second Maimar is about Hatzola people. He's addressing himself to the Hatzola people, and they were asking him whether or not during this cholera epidemic, in order to help and save people, they should expose themselves to danger. Do I expose myself to danger in order to save someone else? And at one point in this essay, which is again Mimer number 2, that is an absolute must reading for anyone who's in Hatzola or anything similar to Hatzola, he speaks about achuzei hasikud. What are the statistical probabilities of danger? And he quotes one of the early sources called the Rikanti, who says the following, that if a person is given the following choice by the terrible Moslim, and they say either allow yourself to have your arm cut off, amputated, or I'm going to kill another Jew, that's called ektos yodcha, v'im lo, erog chavercha, I'm going to kill this Jew. He says that Nimtza, by allowing himself, subjecting himself to having his arm amputated, Rahman al-Islan, he says that's a tremendous danger, and it's outside the purview of Hatzolah. Is that clear so far? Should I repeat that? In other words, the mitzvah of Hatzolah doesn't go as far. This can be relevant to kidney transplants, not so much today to donating a kidney to save someone else's life. Now I think, well, it's a whole different ballgame. But back in the day, and he quotes the Radbaz. The Radbaz says the following, that if the chances of the matzil, right, the Hatzolah person, putting his life into danger is a 50-50 chance that he'll die, whereas the other Jew is going to definitely die, he is not allowed to expose himself to a 50% chance of death. Aval, however, im ha'achuz hu sikud shel pachos mi-50 achuz, if the statistical probability is less than 50%, then muterlo, he's allowed to put his life into danger if it's less than 50%. More than that, it's not just that he's allowed to put his life into danger, but he's obligated to put his life into danger. And I have to tell you that based on this Radbaz, our Mechaber here comes to the conclusion, addressing the Hatzolah people during periods of, for example, infectious diseases like, he mentions Ebola, and then he goes on to talk about Corona in our time. He says, Achuz efsharut sikun hu harbei pachot mi-50 achuz. He says that if the Hatzolah people go in there to save lives, the chances of their chashon losing their life are less than 50% by far if they're protected well with the whole suit and all that, whatever they have to do. And therefore, he addresses the Hatzolah people. So this is where I think he is alluding to about achuzei hasikud. And if that be the case, although again, he doesn't go down this path, but I think he's bringing us to the entranceway, to the shire of this path, that maybe at the end of the day, the Stei Chemet for Yerushalayim and the Chassam Sofer for Preshberg were basically saying the same thing, that the danger element here is way less than 50%. And therefore, we have to approach it from a position of Shomer Yisrael, that God will protect us. Now, at this point, he quotes the tshuva of the Rambam. And it's fascinating to me on the side, this is just Bein Adam Liatzmo, that he quotes the Rambam's letter that was published by Rav Yitzchak Shelat, who was my colleague in Malay Adumim way back when, my first position. And I don't want to talk about this publicly, but I was a little surprised that a Rav from Lakewood, number one, has the scholarship that he knows about Rav Shelat's book, and secondly, that he quotes it publicly. But that's, again, that's off on the side. And the Rambam was asked the following question: is this a fundamental belief that there's a kitzvah? Remember, I told you to write down the word kitzvah. There's a certain number of years that was designated as it's inscribed in the books on high for each person. And whatever happens in his life, that's the amount of years that he was given by God. That cannot be changed. That's a divine decree that's been signed and sealed. And therefore, the Shoel, addressing the Rambam, says, Kevon sheba'olam hazeh ha'chai adam k'tzuvim lo keitz mesuyam asher behechrech yagia elav. Therefore, lo yikteku ha'pgoyim miyamisuhu. All those dangerous, disastrous forces of damage and injury are not going to have any power against him, because he is protected by the divine decree of Nitzavlo. And therefore, he says, even if he is lo zohir, velo shomer, etc., he's guaranteed divine protection. And the Rambam just smashes it to smithereens. And he says the following: Ein etzleinu kates kotzev l'chaim. There's no such thing as an absolute kitzvah. Man is granted freedom of choice. And if he abuses freedom of choice, yochol ha'adam lekarev misaso, he can bring about his own death. That's also included in freedom of choice. God may know what man is going to choose. Maybe the kotzev here is based on God's knowledge of, but that doesn't undermine freedom of choice. The imlo yishmar atzmo min ha'pagayim, if he won't take adequate measures to protect himself from these disasters, then yimisu ha'pagayim. And the Rambam proves it from 3 different sources. Number one, from the mitzvah of v'asisa makel legagecha, which means the Torah is saying, if you don't take ample protection and set up a roof around a fence around your roof, somebody's going to fall off the roof and die. And if you're telling me that, well, I was granted a kitzvah and I'm protected, I'm going to live and die depending upon that divine decree, then the whole mitzvah of Asisa Makel L'Gagecha is meaningless, says the Rambam. Secondly, the Torah affords an ir miklat for Rotzeach B'Shogeg, and that's where he has to run to protect himself from the Gol Adam. Well, what does he need that protection? After all, it's all predetermined in the kitzvah. And thirdly, from the Meshuach Milchama, who thinks that a certain person or individuals are rach levav, they are overwhelmed by fear out in battle, and he tells them to leave the battlefront because otherwise they may get killed in the Milchama. Obviously, we're dealing here with reality. We're dealing here with the material, physical world of Itzius. And we're not saying that there's guaranteed divine protection. So the Rambam says a person has to protect himself from Goyim. He's got to take every measure. He cannot rely on some sort of abstract concept called Zman Katsuv, because Zman Katsuv is if all things are left equal, but if he exposes himself to danger, he's going to die. And at this point, we go back to the tshuva of the Rashbash. If you remember, the Rashbash was the one who said that we got to keep the Torah going, and especially the Malamnei Dardaki, the young children. And the Rashbash writes that Kol Adam Yeshlo Ketz Katsuv Mispar Yemei Chayav. He admits, and maybe the Rambam would also admit it, that there is a Ketz Katsuv Yemei Chayav, but he says it's not an absolute. Misha Chata, if a person sins, then that original kitzvah is now cut down. And therefore, nichnas legeder shel chok efshari b'misas magefa u'b'misas milchama v'chadome. As a result of sin, he has now thrust himself back into the clause, so to speak, of a magefa and of war. So it's quite clear that therefore a person has to watch himself and protect himself. He has to do whatever is necessary, all the shtaglios, to be marchik any kind of sakana. And that's what the Torah means. Otherwise, that kitzvah could be cut down. And it might be because you sinned. And now we get back to the Stei Chemet. You remember the Stei Chemet said, well, I cannot allow eating on Yom Kippur during cholera, although the Ashkenazim did. Which Ashkenazim? And the answer is Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And we're talking about the city of Vilna, which was the center of Torah learning, of spirituality for the Jewish people in Poland and Russia and Eastern Europe at that time. And the cholera epidemic is fierce. So many victims, untold numbers of people who are dying from cholera. And Rabbi Yisrael goes from shul to shul on Yom Kippur night, ordering the people to eat. Everyone has to eat, not just the weak and the old. The Briam have to eat. And he makes Kiddush. And he guarantees that in every shul in the city of Vilna, they will violate Yom Kippur and eat. Stei Chemet, almost at the same time, is not willing to go that far. But not only that, I have to tell you another secret, which I didn't know about. Maybe you did. That the great Rabbi Tzal HaKohen, who was considered the Rav in Vilna, author of many famous Sfarim, told the Bezdin in Vilna that the psak of Rabbi Yisrael Salanta was incorrect. He should have allowed weak people to eat to protect them from cholera, but not healthy people. So that when the Stei Chemet tells you that in Vilna, they had the chutzpah, the not the chutzpah in a negative sense, but I mean to say the plates, as we call it, the shoulders, the gumption to allow eating on Yom Kippur. That's not so simple. True that Rabbi Yisrael did that in the city of Vilna, but he met with great opposition from great rabbis, and the members of the Bezdin in Vilna, under the tutelage of Rabbi Tzal HaKohen, actually opposed him. Now, I thought, before I read this sefer, which I have here, L'Hachil Samra, with my hands, that the reason for Rabbi Yisrael's kula was because you have to have a strong immune system in case you're exposed to this infectious disease. And if you fast, you're going to be weak, and your body will not be able to fight the disease. Name. He says not like that. Goes on, he says you're wrong. It says so in between the lines. And he says the reason why Rabbi Yisrael Paskin, that every last Jew in Vilna, as healthy as he is, has to eat on Yom Kippur, is because Shelo Yavo HaCholim Lidei Sakana, because Rabbi Yisrael was afraid that if it wasn't an all or nothing proposition, if we didn't all get on board to eat on Yom Kippur, then the Cholim, who really have to eat on Yom Kippur because they're exposed to Sakana, would shy away from eating on Yom Kippur. They'd be too embarrassed to do so. Who wants to eat on Yom Kippur? And this psak of Rabbi Yisrael generated an entire literature amongst the Achronim that came afterwards. Is there such a an idea in halacha that because of the psychological problem of somebody, and he's not willing to violate this Isa because he's embarrassed about it, we all have to violate that halacha so that he will overcome his embarrassment. Is there any such source? I mean, Rabbi Yisrael came up. He didn't quote any sources. He banged on the table and said, Rabbi Sai, it's time for Kiddush. So he quotes a tshuva of the Mariel Diskin, who is the Rav in Brisk, who says, based on a Gemara in Sanhedrin, that let's go through the Gemara in Sanhedrin. Actually, it's in the Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin, but Tosfos in Sanhedrin Chafaf quotes this Yerushalmi, that the poor people who cannot even afford to pay rent are allowed to violate Shvius with Charisha and Avodah Besados during the year of Shvius. And Tos says, why? Because it's a sakonis nefashos. What's going to happen is the ani of the poor people owe debts, and their creditors, their balei chov will come and throw them into jail. And Tosa says that in those days to get thrown into jail, kaput. So the sakonis nefashos. Ad kan Tosas comes along the Mariel Diskin, and he says that in that situation where there were aniyim, there were poor people, and their lives were in danger if they would observe the law of Shmiras, lo rak la'aniyim hitiru. They didn't only allow this for the poor people, el afilu lashirim hitiru umitzuvahem. They're obligated to do the avodas karka and violate Shvius. Why? If all of Klal Yisrael would be observing Shemitah and only the Aniyim are going out to work the fields, they will suffer from kisufa, from embarrassment. Therefore, we have to be matir for the Ashirim because of the kisufa of the Aniyim. Mariel Midiskin. Just 1 second, Joe. Do you begin to see what's opening up in front of our eyes here in Rabbi Yisrael Salanta's very revolutionary psak? Because he's worried that if the Briim, the healthy people of Vilna, will observe Yom Kippur, then the Cholim, those who are really in low immune system, will be embarrassed to violate Yom Kippur. And the Mariel Midiskin says that even the wealthy people were commanded to go out there and violate Shvius on that year. I guess that year there was a whole group of Aniyim whose lives were in danger. And because of the kisufa of the Aniyim, the Ashirim will violate Shvius. Yeah, Jim.
So I just, doesn't that go fly in the face of what we understand with Aliyah to Regel?
That if I go on Aliyah to Regel, then I might be embarrassing?
No, Aliyah to Regel is everybody goes.
Right.
Everybody goes.
Right.
Don't look at the fact that somebody's going to get, you have to protect, you have to block something. Everyone goes up and Hashem's going to protect. Isn't that wouldn't that say in this situation, wouldn't you say the same thing in this situation? I mean,
well,
you're not going to, some people with regards to Shemitah, you're not going to do it. They're not going to, you don't have to be embarrassed. You do, and Hashem's going to, I mean, I'm just asking the question. No,
Well, the truth is, Joe, that your question about Aliyah Regel is a very important question for the whole approach here, that we have to take every consideration, every danger, every possible pegia, nezek into consideration. And yet, we see in the case of Aliyah Regel, God promises with a special divine protection. So why Why not extrapolate that? It's not just Halacha and Gibba in Aliyah L'Regel. Maybe for any mitzvah I do, God is going to protect me. So why do I have to worry about all the Emtsa'ei Shmirah and protect myself? That's an excellent question. I think the answer to your question is that's the divine promise in a unique situation, what we call a Din Miyuchad in Aliyah L'Regel. But we're saying something totally different here, Joe. Let me give you a mashal of my davar dov, so you'll understand clearly what I have in mind. A man is a choler, and we're about to violate the Shabbos in order to save him. He's in a sakana situation. Are you still there, Joe? I lost you for some reason. Okay.
Yeah, I just lost my picture for a second. That's all.
Oh, okay. You zoomed out on me here. It's okay. You're in the majority here. I mean, except for Bobby, all I see is my own beautiful face. It's very. I also see the kotel here, but I don't know where David is. But anyway, what I'm trying. Oh, there you are. Hi. What I'm trying to suggest is the cholah says to you, "Don't save me unless you smoke on Shabbos." Do I smoke on Shabbos because he's not going to allow me to save his life until he smokes on Shabbos? You know what I'm saying? Can I just create all sorts of psychological situations and allow people to violate Shabbos and Yom Kippur because of this psychology? And this is the radical approach of Rabbi Yisrael, ordering us, not allowing us to eat on Yom Kippur with Bria, because otherwise those who really have to eat on Yom Kippur will be too embarrassed. And that too is called Sakonis Nefashos. And the Maral Midiskin, we should violate the Ashirim and the Aniyim alike, Shvius, because the Aniyim will be embarrassed to do so. The Halacha has to take into consideration that those who have to violate the law because of Sakonis Nefashos will be inhibited from doing so because of Kisufa. And if there is a reality of Kisufa, then we're going to extend the heter to everyone. And even those who have no Pikuach Nefesh, no Sakonis Nefashos, will violate the law, Shabbos, Yom Kippur, and the like. Why? Because it's Sakonis Nefashos for someone else.
Can I say something, Rabbi Burzan?
Yes, please.
Fasting on Yom Kippur is midiraisa. I mean, for everyone. It's not like whether or not you're going to lend money to someone and then you can't pay it back, and the laws of Shemitah. This is so holy. How can you compare the two?
Well,
this.
Let's say the Rabbi Yisrael went even further than the Maril Midiskin, but the principle is the same. I'll tell you why. Because if the Aniyim will not work on Shvius, Tosfos says that will be a Sakonis Nefashos. Because in those days, if you couldn't pay your debtors and you got thrown into the clink, it was like goodbye, child. So we have to absolutely guarantee, for the sake of the Pikuach Nefesh of the Aniyim, a violation of Shvius. And now the Maril Midiskin says we're all going to violate, even the Ashirim, for the sake of the Aniyim, because they're embarrassed unless it's a communal effort to violate Shvius. Now you're right, that's only Shvius. Shvius is a lav d'oraisa, but it doesn't shine a candle to Yom Kippurim. And according to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, if there's pikuach nefesh for the cholim, because as a result of their embarrassment, they're not going to eat on Yom Kippur, and we, the Briam, have to eat on Yom Kippur, we're going to violate the Isakares of the Nisa Vetz Nafshel Seichem because of the pikuach nefesh of the cholim.
There's so many ifs. If this, if that, we're straightforward. We must fast on Yom Kippur. That is Yom Hadin. I mean, it's not
okay.
A subcategory.
What can I tell you? You're on the side of Rabbi Tzal Cohen and his Bezdin. You have a pretty solid basis. But I just want to, I want to emphasize that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was not a lightweight champion. He was a heavyweight champion.
It's Ben Adam. He's a human being making a decision against the Torah, which is...
Well, no, I wouldn't say it's against the Torah. Again, he's telling you that it's pikuach nefesh. He's telling you that there's a cholera epidemic, and the cholim are going to chas v'sholom perish unless they eat on Yom Kippur. But his chiddush is that the cholim will not eat on Yom Kippur. And if you accept that as a reality, then he says that our obligation of pikuach nefesh goes this way. Now, if you give me just 1 minute, I want to show you what an impact, what an implication this would have in terms of our situation today, our corona situation. A man comes forward and he tells you that I am immune. Okay, he took a serology test, or he already had corona, he's in recovery, and the statistics of having corona second time are negligible, whatever. The man comes to the conclusion, he's decided in his own mind that he's not afraid. He's a grace of al bitochen, and on his pious level, he thinks that he doesn't need these precautionary methods. He is protected. Okay, now, again, I don't want to get into a debate with you about whether he's justified, whether we should send him to a shrink or not. I just accept the reality right now. Yankel Beryl is convinced that he will not be infected. Oh, no. He may have a light case of corona. He may have a certain immune system that would battle against corona, but he may infect others. So you'll tell me, well, what do I care about infecting others? But we see clearly that our obligation in the framework of sakonas nefashos and pikuach nefesh is not just because of ourselves. Those who are healthy can fast on Yom Kippur, and they will tell Rabbi Yisrael, why shouldn't I fast on Yom Kippur? And Rabbi Yisrael is saying you got to eat on Yom Kippur because you have to be concerned with the pikuach nefesh of someone else. So that if you want to take an easy, backseat, confident attitude towards corona, realize that pikuach nefesh is not just for you. You don't have to you're not going to limit yourself as if you are Robinson Crusoe and say, well, I don't have to worry about corona. You have to worry about the possibility of being a carrier that could possibly infect others. And that too comes under pikuach nefesh. So let me make a few comments here as we kind of wrap things up on Siman Daled, which I find very engaging, because I really want to go on to Siman Zayin if we have time. He quotes a fascinating point made by Rav Moshe Sternbuch Shlita. He's just a few feet away from me now. And Rav Sternbuch says that the Gemara tells us that in certain areas of the world during certain periods of time, Hanukkah was a sakana. They lit the Hanukkah candles publicly on the outside, mi Pesach Beso mi bachutz, and it became a sakana. So at that point, mishas sakana v'elis, the Gemara says, madliko al shulchano v'daya. He lights the Hanukkah candles inside. So Rav Sternbuch asks the obvious question. The poskim write, again, on Eretz Yisrael is a little different. We have here in Yerushalayim different minhagim, but if you go out in the Welt, then people light Hanukkah candles inside their homes. And certainly the poskim would say, whether that's the best way of doing it or not, but you yotzei the mitzvah. Why? It's no longer a shas sakana. Says Rav Moshe Sternbuch, because somewhere in the world, at least at that time, I don't know, today you have to know, it was a sakana. Then even in locations elsewhere on the face of the globe, where there is no sakana, the Chazal are going to reenact the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, change its fundamental structure, and tell you to light inside instead of outside. Why? Because over there, it's a sakana. But once again, we see the principle is crystal clear. that we have to worry about sakana, not just for ourselves, but the possible repercussions in terms of creating sakana for someone else. And Rabbi Yisrael's argument was that if I don't eat on Yom Kippur, and I don't have sakana, then the person who really needs to eat on Yom Kippur, he's also not going to eat on Yom Kippur. He's inhibited. And the Maral Midiskin says that if I don't do Meleches Avodah on Shvius, then that person who's an ani, who might get thrown into jail and his life is in danger, he's also going to be inhibited and he won't do Malacha on Shvius. We have to care about the next one. And at the end of this whole long essay, he quotes a letter from Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And this letter was written in the year 1831. Sound familiar? I mean, that's the same year that the Chassam Sofer, Haskin, despite the cholera epidemic, that we have to keep the yeshivas and the shuls open. And it's fascinating. This letter of Rabbi Akiva Eiger is really interesting. He says that when the cholera epidemic broke out, the Shultonos determined all what he calls the Chukei Hanagal Shmir Sabrios, all the requirements of the Ministry of Health. Rabbi Akiva Eiger writes a letter. We have it dated. It's actually on the second day, meaning Monday, of Parshas Nitzavim in the year Tovkuf Tzadi Aleph 1831. And he writes, Shmana Ligodel Zehirusenu, how careful we have to be. And he writes that Lidaiti Akibutz B'mokom Tsar Eino Nochon. Interesting. To gather together large numbers of people in a small area, it's a bad idea. The Efshar Lispalel Kitos Ubechol Pam didn't say miat. In 1831, Rabbi Akiva Eiger is telling us to have sequential minyanim with small numbers. Erech Tesvav Anoshim. Maximum 15 people in a minyan. And he tells you to recite certain tehillim after the minyan and a prayer on behalf of the melech, of the king, Garam Hodo. And he says, Yesh Lachush, we have to be careful. Shlo Yidchuku Anoshim Yosef Misachanal, more than 15 people into the Beis HaKnesses. And then he goes on to say that we should hire a policeman. Do you hear this? Lahamid Shomer policeman, Shoter, Lashgiach was there, to make sure that there's no violation. This is Rabbi Akiva Eiger in the year 1831. Lishomer Miod. And then he says, the Yesh Laharche Kol Minei Atzmus. I didn't know that Rabbi Akiva Eiger was a Bretzl V'Chassid. Right? I mean, the worst thing for a Bretzl is an Atzmus. He says we have to be Marche Kol Minei Atzmus. And he goes on to say that we have to be very careful about these rules. And then he signs Yedidi, etc. Akiva Gantz. That's what his last name was, Gantz. Very interesting. Now, before we go on, I just want to look at my watch, see where we're up to here. We don't have that much time to do Simon Zion, so maybe we'll leave that for next time. I don't know. But I want to add 2 points that he makes here in the essay. He says he wants to impress upon us that the story of the Chassam Sofer that we built so much on is not such a simple matter. Because if you open up the Tshuva Sefer, until now we were quoting a letter of the Chassam Sofer. If you open up his Tshuva Sefer, in Chelik Vav, Siman Gimel, he writes that laharchik es sakona, again, he's talking about the cholera epidemic. He says, B'shas hamagefa, v'amru arofim she'ein lotzeis hachutza b'kreisa reika. That's an Aramaic form of an empty stomach. Don't go out with an empty stomach. V'yesh bazeh sakonas mavis. Again, we would until now we talked about keeping the yeshivas open, and now, excuse me, in the tshuva, the Chassam Sofer paskins that ha'ikar lekayim dinei ha'inui shel Yom HaKippurim sheyesh bazeh isur kares aval yasgiru atzmam b'bateim v'yisbatlu al yedei zeh tefillah b'tzibur v'kriyas haTorah b'Yom HaKippur. Very complicated. The yeshivas remain open, and it's Talmud Torah, it's Gem Chayenu, Eitz Chaim Ilam Azikimbo, like a fish out of water if we close the yeshivas. And yet, we're not going to have a davening on Yom HaKippurim. We're going to close the synagogues, and we're going to daven at home. No Kriyas HaTorah on Yom HaKippurim. And the ikar is that we don't violate the Isur Kares of Inu. So lest one come to the mistaken conclusion that the Chassam Sofer was totally relying on miracles when he said that we have to keep the yeshivas going during the epidemic. Read this tshuva and see how Rabbi Kiveg, how the Chassam Sofer himself ruled and advocated that we close the shuls on Yom Kippur, no tefillah b'tzibur on Yom Kippur, no reading of the Torah on Yom Kippur, and we fast on Yom Kippur. Now, the Chassam Sofer fasting on Yom Kippur is similar to the Stei Chemed that we spoke about before, although the Stei Chemed probably had in mind the psak, the ruling of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, I don't know for sure. Namely, I have to eat on Yom Kippur, not just the cholim, but even the briam have to eat on Yom Kippur. And the Chassam Sofer paskin, no. We're going to lock ourselves in the room, in our homes, no tefillah b'tzibur, but we're going to fast on Yom Kippur. Now, there's one more point that I wanted to add and then let you go. Yeah. In the Shut Shuvas Hanhagos, which we quoted earlier by Moshe Sternbach, he says that Meuberes violedes she'ein shum sakona levlad. So a pregnant woman or after childbirth, if she fasts, it will not endanger the life of the fetus. So let's talk about a muberes. Okay, so the muberes, if she fasts on Yom Kippur, ein shum sakona levlad. And he writes, Yutru lecho. He says that, I'm not sure if he paskins this way or he's just raising this as a possibility. We should allow them to eat kevon, the ulai b'makom rachok ba'olam. Maybe somewhere in the world there's another muberes, and whole life, or at least the life of the fetus, might be endangered by her fasting. He says, how far can we go with this? If we take the heter of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter or the Mariel Diskin to its extreme, and we say that we have to worry about kisufa, that somebody who has to really violate the law, whether it's Yom Kippur or whether it's Shvius, will be inhibited to do so because of kisufa. If we have to be matir even the briim, even the healthy people on Yom Kippur, he says, shouldn't we be matir, therefore, every single me'uberes, every pregnant woman, to eat on Yom Kippur, because there's some woman out there who's a muberes, and she's embarrassed to eat on Yom Kippur, and she's going to endanger the life of the vlad. And if I read this correctly, unfortunately, I don't have access to the Chuvas Van Huggis. It's not on Bar Ilan. I have the feeling that what he's saying is that he understands very well why there was a tremendous uproar and a hesitation to accept the kula and the psak of Rabbi Yisrael, because how far can we take this? Are we going to say that Mishum Kisufa, everything is mutter? We could be matter the whole Torah, at Tova, you could be matara sheretz. Why? Because Yenim out there at the end of the globe is really in a sakana, and if that person is inhibited to violate Yom Kippur when they really need to, then we have to violate Yom Kippur. So that every Muberis is going to look over our shoulder and compare herself to another Muberis. And every other Muberis is fasting on Yom Kippur. She's not going to have the gumption of fasting on Yom Kippur. Meanwhile, that's the Sakanas of Vlad. So therefore, we should make a carte blanche statement that no Muberis should fast on Yom Kippur. How far can we go with this logic? And that's why I submit to you that Hamatzav Shalonu, he writes, Ledina, Shemagefa Sakarona Sholetes Umitpashetet, and many very holy, very cherished nefashos have been taken from us. He says, Bavadai, Chova Mutelas Aleinu Lishmar al Chayenu. This is the rabbi's final conclusion. We have to take every precautionary measure. Veloli Kyle Bebate Knesios. It's not just a matter of my personal sakonis nefashos. We have to worry about somebody else. But Salomar, the ofet shekol echad v'echad mitanu mamish bedin safek rodef, we might be endangering others. V'havile kineshek ta'un, he says it's like we're carrying a loaded weapon. Sheyachol chas v'sholem lahavi misa al acherim v'afilu im hu atzmo margish tov v'na'im. He doesn't want to take any protection, any measures. Aval yachol yoshu noseas virus. He may be carrying this virus and he doesn't even realize it because he feels great. He has no symptoms. Ubetseso mi beso litzkoil amacherim yochol ahadbik acherim v'yitochen sheyigrom lahem misa. Rachmana litzlan. And he says, even if it's a sveka, nevertheless, when it comes to sakana, we have to take that into consideration, and therefore we have to take all these measures. Even if a person says, I can't be a carrier because I feel great. Well, guess what? You might feel great, but you might at the same time be infected with corona, and you might be a carrier. That's the way he concludes this entire Siman. You can see clearly on which side of the equation he is. And the situation that we're facing still defies clear-cut answers. Again, this is his approach. But we did mention a bunch of other tshuvas, especially Rabbi Yisrael, especially the tshuva of the Chassam Sofer and the Stei Chemed, and also implications in the Rashbash that maybe perhaps there's room for arguing the other side of the coin. But as I said, his conclusion is crystal clear. Sakonis nefashos, even svek sveka, obligates us. Now, he had quoted the statistical issue back in the Hatzolah discussion that he referred to back to Simon Bayes. I'm not sure if the equation, the analogy is precise. In other words, you're talking about sakana when a person is in charge of Hatzolah, that's one issue. But I don't know if that has anything to do with this controversy, this confused, ambiguous issue about, closing the yeshivas and closing the shuls, whether or not the same statistical probability theory is halachically valid in that context. It's valid in terms of exposing yourself to sakana for the sake of saving someone else. But now we're talking about just the opposite, that you might be exposing someone else to sakana. And here I don't know if we can justify any sort of tshuva similar to that of the Sam Sofer in the Corona era by saying, well, you know what? I would say that there's a 90% chance that I'm protected from Corona. That percentage is not relevant when it comes to your exposing others to danger. If you're talking about exposing yourself to danger for the sake of Hatzolah, we had the Radbaz and 50% or less and so forth and so on. But if you're talking about exposing others to danger, that's already a different. And then, yeah, Bob.
A number of questions, comments. First of all, the next page, Mem Base in the Sefer.
Yeah.
So is that the end of this tshuva?
That is the end of the tshuva.
And the person who is listed there, Akiva Gins, he is the one who asked the question?
No, he's Rabbi Akiva.
No, Akiva Gins.
Akiva Gins is Rabbi Akiva. His name was not Ager.
No, but if you look at Mem Base,
right,
it says
Akoton Akiva Gins. That's Rabbi Akiva.
No, Mem Base. You have page Mem Base?
Yeah, and the letter is signed by Hakoton Akiva Gins. Do you see that?
No, okay. I'm talking about. It says the beginning of the page says B'zeh Shachris Pana B'Yadav.
Right. That page is a photocopy, Bobby, of this page that I'm reading from.
Okay. So that is the letter from Akiva Eger.
Correct.
Okay, fine.
In fact, there's someone in Toronto. I'm trying to remember his name.
Yeah, that's why I was asking. Akiva Gins. We have an Akiva Gins who lives in
He
Lakewood.
is a descendant of Rabbi Akiva.
I didn't know that.
The name Ager comes, I think, from Rabbi Akiva's father-in-law, or something like that. I don't remember. I have to look that up.
Okay. Anyway, I was curious whether, because it was hard to see from the photocopies what that looked like just the end of the tshuva. Anyway, so
that is the end of the letter, right?
I thought did Akiva Gins ask the questions?
No, that's the end of the tshuva. Yeah.
Anyway, but the other thing is, so I understand more like tachlis here. So at the end of the day, like how is his conclusion that we should observe and basically close down against what the Chassam Sofer said? Like how is he distinguishing between the Chassam Sofer saying, you got to keep it open, the Torah is the Torah, like Em Chayenu.
I can't do more than show you page Lamed Vav, which starts with the words Udvar Pella, if you can find those words.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that in the second paragraph on that page, and the first line in the next paragraph, Achem Nireh, the only clue he gives us here is that when do we say Ein Somchin Al Nes? And yet the Chassam Sofer seems to be violating that principle, and he's relying on divine protection. He says Tzarech Iyun. In other words, he really throws out a difficult question on the Chassam Sofer, but he says Ulai. Maybe it depends on Achuzei Sikun, and he writes K'moshe Kasavnu Li'el.
Even though he ends up that the statistics are irrelevant, the Svek Sveka and everything, it doesn't matter.
Well, yes and no.
He says that mitzvah putting yourself in a sakana, maybe you can rely on statistics to say I don't have to do that, but mitzvah how you behave with the community. He's saying at the end that even if it's a svek sveka and everything, but if there's any chance that you're going to spread this thing, you stay away.
Right. So, right. Whatever I say, I'm just trying to defend the author here because
I didn't read the whole tshuva, so I'm just
saying that this one little crossroads in the tshuva is so ambiguous, if you know what I'm saying. So I can only try the best I can.
Right.
I don't have any commitment here to, I'm not the author that has to defend himself, but what I think he has in mind is the following, that the Chassam Sofer came to the conclusion that there's no sakana to keep the yeshivas going. And when we talk about svek sveka and all that, and we have to take every last precaution, that's because there is a certain minimum achuzei sakana. He doesn't tell you what that number is, but on the one hand, again, it's a very complicated situation. On the one hand, when it comes to my exposing myself to a certain statistical danger in order to save your life, then unless it's 50%, I got to jump in there and save you. So that's a very large, significant percentage of sakana. On the other hand, the percentage of sakana goes down to nearly zero when it's a problem of saving others. That's number one. Number two, he's implying, again, I can't speak on his behalf. We should write him a letter. He doesn't give you his phone number here, and that is that the Chassam Sofer apparently, because he says ulai, that word ulai here after the Tzarech Iyun, because he says I don't understand the psak of the Chassam Sofer. Dvarim tmuin, lechor ze neged halacha, he writes against the Chassam Sofer. The ain't somchin al nes muchuyavim anu l'shma b'atzas harofim ukviyasam. How could the Chassam Sofer say we gather together during the corona and we study in yeshiva? And the only answer I can give you after this Tzarech Iyun is vi'ulai. Vi'ulai means yesh liyashiv b'dochak, that maybe the Chassam Sofer came to the conclusion that the statistical probabilities of the yeshiva students getting corona, or in this case cholera, is so minimum that it doesn't register as a sakana. Again, you're going to turn back and ask me, but he himself, the author, writes clearly that I have to worry about yenim sakana no matter how small the percentage is. So maybe I'm in a great situation here that I can go to yeshiva. I don't have to worry, God will protect me, but what about infecting someone else? Very difficult to put this all into some sort of a...
Right, I mean, and even if you go back to Rabbi Kiva, it's not that there was... Rabbi Kiva was not saying that there's no danger. He was saying that afal pikein, we have to do what we have to do because, we have to keep the Torah going.
Right, and the Chassam Sofer turns it the other way around. He says, not only do we have to do what we have to do to keep the Torah going, but the Torah is what we absolutely need during this. It's like a special, if you have yeshivas open from 7 a.m. till 10 p.m. during the year, regular healthy year, then during corona or during cholera in the Chassam Sofer's context, should have the yeshiva open from 6 in the morning till 11 at night because Kihem Chayenu,
Right.
this is the Eitz Chaim Yamachzikim.
Right. Anyway, that interesting
Very, very
dilemma.
fascinating because when you walk out of this tshuva, you see that nothing, we say about Corona that nothing is clear. I don't know. I'm not up on the latest news. I haven't been following. I know there's talk about a vaccine. I don't know where that's going. But if we don't know enough about Corona, this becomes a major issue. Now, what I want to do next time, and I think David already sent out these copies, and I apologize if it's not clear because I'm not a professional photographer. I take pictures of it and send it on WhatsApp, is Simon Zain. So you'll take a look, and he wants to know here, it's on page Samach Gimel in this book, whether or not we can rely on the assessment, evaluation of non-Jewish physicians. We started this last week. I want to continue and complete it in order to make decisions about overriding the Shabbos and so on.